The company ballroom went dead silent. On the town hall stage, Richard Hale leaned into the microphone and said his older daughter would always come first. Then he looked straight at Emily in front of hundreds of employees and made it worse. He said she would never measure up. Several phones slowly lifted. What no one in that room knew was this: Emily wasn't standing there empty-handed. And in less than 30 seconds, compliance was about to walk through that door. The company ballroom went dead quiet. Not the polite kind of quiet, the heavy kind. The kind that makes people stop breathing without realizing it. Rows of employees filled the polished space inside Hale Dynamics headquarters. Glass walls, soft corporate lighting, a massive LED screen glowing behind the stage. The annual town hall always drew a crowd, but today the air felt tighter than usual. Anticipation, pressure, something just slightly off. At center stage, Richard Hale stood at the podium like he owned the oxygen in the room. Early 60s, impeccable navy suit, silver hair perfectly in place, the kind of CEO employees described as controlled, disciplined, untouchable, and right now, very pleased with himself. To his right sat Lauren Hale, his eldest daughter, composed, elegant, chin slightly lifted. She wore the calm confidence of someone who had never once walked into a room and wondered if she belonged there. To his left, several feet away, sat Emily Hale. Younger, quieter, watching everything. Richard's voice carried smoothly through the ballroom speakers. He was praising leadership, growth, vision, the usual corporate rhythm. Employees nodded along. Some typed notes. Others scrolled quietly on their phones under the table. Then Richard's tone shifted. Subtle, but sharp enough that heads began to lift. He turned slightly toward Lauren, one hand opening in a polished gesture. He spoke about continuity, about legacy, about the future leadership of Hale Dynamics. Lauren's lips pressed into a modest smile that did not quite hide the satisfaction in her eyes. Emily did not move. Then it happened. Richard leaned closer to the microphone, his voice lowering just enough to command full attention. He said his older daughter had always understood what this company required. A few approving murmurs moved through the room. Then came the line that changed the temperature completely. "Your sister comes first." The words landed flat and heavy in the ballroom. No laughter, no polite applause, just silence spreading row by row. Several employees shifted in their seats. A senior manager in the third row slowly stopped typing. Someone near the back lifted their phone a little higher, because everyone in that room understood exactly what Richard had just done. He had not only praised Lauren, he had ranked Emily publicly. Richard's gaze moved across the audience before settling directly on Emily's section of the room, and he did not stop there. His voice stayed smooth, almost conversational. He added that leadership was not about effort alone, it was about instinct, judgment, consistency. Each word sounded professional on the surface, but underneath, the message was unmistakable. Emily was not the one. A faint ripple moved through the employees. Not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet discomfort of people witnessing something that suddenly felt too personal for a corporate stage. Lauren remained perfectly still, but the corner of her mouth tightened for just a fraction of a second. Emily noticed. Emily noticed everything. She sat upright in her chair, hands resting lightly on the black folder in her lap. Her expression did not crack. Not anger, not embarrassment, not even surprise. That was the first thing that made people uneasy, because most people in that moment would have reacted, shifted, flinched, looked down. Emily did none of those things. Her eyes stayed on her father, calm, steady, almost prepared. Richard seemed to expect some kind of visible reaction. When none came, a faint crease appeared between his brows before he smoothed it away and continued speaking. But the rhythm of the room had already changed. Employees were no longer casually listening. They were watching. The leadership team along the side wall had gone very still. Even the HR director had stopped taking notes. Something was building. Richard continued outlining the company's strategic direction, but the earlier comment hung in the air like static. Then, midway through his next point, he paused. Just briefly. His eyes flicked toward the operations section, toward Emily's division, and when he spoke again, the tone had shifted. Sharper now, more deliberate. He mentioned that Hale Dynamics had recently identified a concerning internal data irregularity. The word irregularity landed like a dropped glass. Several heads turned, a few shoulders stiffened. Richard's gaze did not leave Emily's side of the room, and for the first time that morning, the pressure in the ballroom began to rise. Emily's fingers slowly tightened on the black folder in her lap, but her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm enough to cut clean through the silence. She said she was glad he brought that up, because she had been waiting for this meeting all week, and suddenly, dozens of phones lifted higher. The shift in the room was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but sharp enough that people felt it in their shoulders. Richard Hale did not like being interrupted, especially not in his own town hall, especially not by Emily. For a fraction of a second, his expression hardened. Then the polished CEO mask slid smoothly back into place. He gave a thin, controlled smile. He said he was pleased to hear Emily was taking the situation seriously, but the tone underneath the words carried weight. Pressure. A quiet warning. Across the ballroom, employees leaned forward in their seats. No one was pretending to check email anymore. Even the executives along the side wall had gone completely still. Lauren sat poised beside the stage table, but something subtle had changed. Her fingers were now lightly interlocked instead of relaxed on the surface. The movement was small, almost invisible. Emily noticed. Richard continued, voice measured and calm. He explained that the company had flagged unusual access activity tied to sensitive internal files. Nothing dramatic in the wording. Very corporate, very careful. But then he added the part that tightened the air. The activity, he said, appeared to originate from within Emily's operational unit. A quiet wave moved through the room. Not gasps, not whispers. Just the soft collective intake of breath from people who understood exactly what kind of accusation was forming. Several employees in Emily's department shifted in their chairs. One manager near the aisle slowly lowered his eyes to the table. Another subtly angled her body away from Emily's row. The social temperature was dropping fast. Richard kept his posture relaxed behind the podium, but his gaze remained fixed in Emily's direction. He said the company took data integrity extremely seriously. He said leadership required accountability. He said no one was above internal review. Each sentence sounded professionally neutral. Together, they formed a very public spotlight, and it was pointed directly at Emily. Lauren finally moved, just slightly. She turned her head toward the audience with a composed expression that almost read as concern. Almost. But her eyes flicked once toward Emily, quick, measuring. Emily did not shrink under it. She did not look down. She did not rush to defend herself. Instead, she rose slowly from her seat. The movement was calm enough to make several people in the front row straighten. Her black folder stayed in her hand, still closed, still quiet. Richard's jaw tightened just a fraction as she stood. He had expected discomfort, maybe denial, maybe visible pressure. What he was seeing instead was something far more controlled. Emily's voice carried clearly across the ballroom without the microphone. She said she agreed that accountability mattered. She said she was glad the company was finally addressing the irregularity. That word again. Irregularity. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. The room was fully locked in now. Emily took one small step into the aisle beside her row. Not approaching the stage, not retreating either. Just enough movement to signal she was not backing down. Phones were definitely up now. Not hidden anymore, open recording. Lauren's posture had gone very still. Richard adjusted his grip on the podium. Emily's fingers slid along the edge of the black folder, still closed, still controlled. Then she spoke again, her tone steady but pointed enough to cut through the corporate polish. She said there was just one thing she wanted to clarify before anyone drew conclusions. A pause spread across the ballroom. Even the air conditioning hum seemed louder. Emily lifted the folder slightly. Not opening it yet. Just enough for people to notice. She said the flagged access activity did not originate where leadership thought it did. This time, the ripple in the room was impossible to miss. Richard did not move. But the confidence in his posture had shifted by a single, dangerous degree. Lauren's fingers tightened together, and on the massive LED screen behind the stage, the display flickered once. The flicker on the LED screen was brief, but it was enough. Enough to make every head in the ballroom tilt upward at the same time. The display returned to the company logo, clean and harmless. No data, no charts, no obvious problem. Still, the room did not relax, because something had shifted. Richard Hale saw it too. His hand tightened slightly on the edge of the podium before he smoothed the movement away. When he spoke again, his voice carried that familiar executive calm. Controlled, professional, firm. He said the company's internal review process was already underway. He said speculation in a public forum was not productive. On the surface, it sounded reasonable. Underneath, it sounded like containment. Emily remained standing in the aisle, the black folder still closed in her hand. She did not look defensive. She did not look nervous. If anything, she looked like someone waiting for a clock to run down. That detail made several people in the front rows exchange quick glances. Richard's eyes stayed locked on her. He said if Emily had relevant information, she should follow proper internal channels. Not the stage, not this room. The message was clear. Stand down. Emily's expression did not change. She spoke calmly. She said she had followed internal channels. A small crease formed between Richard's brows. Across the stage table, Lauren shifted for the first time in a way that was not perfectly controlled. Her shoulders drew back slightly, posture tightening, like someone bracing without meaning to. Emily noticed. So did the HR director along the side wall. The room was getting very quiet now. Emily took another small step forward into the aisle. Still respectful distance from the stage, still composed, but no longer passive. Her voice stayed even. She said the review process had started 3 weeks ago. A murmur moved through the leadership section. 3 weeks was not new. 3 weeks meant someone had been watching. Richard's jaw flexed once. He asked, very evenly, what exactly Emily was implying. There it was, the first crack in the rhythm. Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned her head slightly toward the massive screen behind the stage. That single glance pulled half the room's attention with it. The screen flickered again. This time, longer. Not a full change, just enough static movement to trigger unease. Lauren's fingers were no longer calmly folded. One thumb pressed hard against the side of her hand, the tension now visible to anyone paying close attention. Emily finally looked back at her father. Her tone remained respectful, but there was steel under it now. She said she was not implying anything. She said she was waiting for the full audit view to load. Silence dropped hard across the ballroom. Richard's confidence did not disappear, but it shifted, subtly, dangerously, because for the first time that morning, he stopped speaking, and at the back of the ballroom, one of the double doors quietly opened. The soft click of the ballroom doors did not sound loud, but in the silence, it carried. Heads turned instinctively toward the back of the room. Two figures stepped inside, dark suits, neutral expressions, corporate badges clipped cleanly at the waist. Not security, not event staff. People in this company recognized that posture. Compliance. A visible ripple moved through the leadership section. Richard Hale saw them immediately. For the first time that morning, his stillness looked intentional instead of effortless. He did not acknowledge them yet. Instead, he turned his attention fully back to Emily. His voice, when it came, was calm but firmer than before. He said this town hall was not the place for procedural theater. The wording was smooth. The warning underneath it was not. Emily did not flinch. She stood in the aisle with the same steady posture, the black folder now resting lightly against her side. Her eyes stayed on her father. When she spoke, her tone remained respectful, but it no longer carried any hesitation. She said she agreed this was not theater. She said that was exactly why she had waited until the audit team confirmed the timeline. A quiet murmur moved through the room. Richard's jaw tightened a fraction. He asked what timeline she believed she was referring to. Short, controlled. But the temperature had changed. Emily lifted the black folder slightly, not opening it yet, just enough to make the gesture deliberate. She said the timeline of the flagged access activity. She said the same timeline leadership had referenced earlier. Across the stage table, Lauren's posture had gone very still. Too still. Several employees in the front rows were openly watching her now instead of Emily. Richard stepped slightly away from the podium. A subtle move, but a telling one. He said the internal review was ongoing and incomplete. He said drawing premature conclusions in front of staff would be irresponsible. Professional words. Defensive energy. Emily nodded once, slow and measured. She said that was fair. Then she added something that made the room tighten again. She said that was why she'd not drawn any conclusions. Another pause spread across the ballroom. Phones were fully raised now. No one was pretending otherwise. Emily's gaze shifted briefly toward the back doors where the compliance officers had stopped just inside the room. Waiting. Watching. Then she looked back at her father. Her voice dropped slightly, calm but unmistakably direct. She said she had simply followed the access trail, the way company policy required. A flicker of irritation crossed Richard's face before he masked it. He asked, evenly, what exactly she believed she had found. There it was, the challenge. Clear, public. Emily did not answer right away. Instead, she finally opened the black folder. The sound of the paper sliding free seemed louder than it should have been. Inside the folder were several printed sheets, clean, organized, flagged with colored tabs. Not dramatic, not messy, professional. That detail made the HR director sit up straighter. Emily held the documents at her side, still not handing them over, still in control of the pace. Her eyes met her father's. Steady, unblinking. She said quietly that the access pattern did not originate in her unit. This time, the reaction in the room was immediate. A low wave of whispers started and then quickly died as people realized they were reacting out loud. Richard did not move. But the confidence in his stance had shifted again. Emily took one small breath. Then she delivered the line that changed everything. She said the access pattern originated from an executive credential. Silence dropped hard across the ballroom, and near the back wall, one of the compliance officers finally started walking toward the stage. The sound of approaching footsteps carried farther than it should have. Measured, unhurried, impossible to ignore. Every head in the ballroom tracked the same movement as the compliance team advanced up the center aisle. Two officers in dark, tailored suits, expressions neutral in that distinctly corporate way that meant they already knew more than they were saying. The energy in the room flipped. Not chaotic, controlled tension, the dangerous kind. Richard Hale straightened slightly near the podium, his executive composure snapping back into place by force of habit. When he spoke, his voice was smooth again, but now there was an edge beneath it. He said the town hall would proceed as scheduled. A quiet attempt to reassert control. It landed weaker than it would have 10 minutes earlier, because the room was no longer looking only at him. They were watching the aisle. Lauren's posture had gone rigid beside the stage table. Her chin remained lifted, but the calm polish from earlier was starting to thin at the edges. One of her hands had curled lightly against the armrest. Emily did not move from where she stood. The black folder remained open in her hand, documents visible but not yet displayed. She looked neither surprised nor triumphant. Just ready. The lead compliance officer reached the front row and paused, offering a brief, professional nod toward the stage. Her voice carried clearly when she spoke. She said she apologized for the interruption. She said the team needed to address a time-sensitive review item related to the access irregularity referenced earlier. A visible ripple moved through the executive section. Richard's jaw tightened before he answered. He said the company would follow proper process and that any review could be handled after the meeting. Polite, firm, but no longer fully in command. The compliance officer did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply said the review had already reached the threshold for immediate visibility. That sentence landed heavier than anything else that morning. Immediate visibility. Employees in the middle rows exchanged quick looks. Lauren's fingers pressed harder into the armrest now, the first clear sign of strain breaking through her composed exterior. Emily finally stepped one pace closer to the stage. Not aggressive, not hesitant, just deliberate. Her voice remained even. She said she believed the team might want the audit screen active. For the first time, several executives turned sharply toward the massive LED display behind Richard. The screen flickered again. Longer this time. Richard followed their gaze. And for a brief moment, the confidence in his expression slipped. Only slightly, but enough. The compliance officer gave a small confirming nod toward the AV control station along the side wall. Someone off-screen moved quickly. The LED display behind the stage went dark. Then a loading bar appeared. Slow, methodical, unavoidable. The entire ballroom watched in silence. Emily lowered the folder slightly but did not look away from the stage. And as the first lines of audit data began to resolve on the screen, Lauren finally stopped looking calm. The loading bar finished. The screen behind the stage snapped into focus. Rows of clean corporate data filled the massive display. Timestamps, user credentials, access pathways. The kind of information most employees never saw unless something had gone very wrong. And something had. A low murmur rippled through the ballroom before dying quickly under the weight of what people were reading. Emily remained still in the aisle. The black folder rested calmly in her hand now, almost secondary. Because the real story was unfolding behind her. The lead compliance officer stepped slightly forward, her tone precise and professional. She said the review team had completed an initial trace of the flagged access activity. No drama, no accusation, just facts. Richard Hale kept his posture upright near the podium, but the tightness in his shoulders had become visible to anyone watching closely. His eyes moved rapidly across the screen, scanning line by line, looking for something, or hoping not to find it. The officer continued. She said the first alerts had triggered 19 days earlier. The access attempts were not random. They followed a consistent pattern. Same credential tier, same restricted folders, same after-hours window. Employees in the front rows leaned forward unconsciously. Someone near the back whispered under their breath before catching themselves. Lauren had not moved, but the calm polish from earlier was gone now. Her fingers were no longer resting neatly together. One hand had shifted to the edge of the table, grip just tight enough to whiten the knuckles. Emily noticed. Emily noticed everything. The compliance officer gestured toward the screen. A highlighted sequence appeared. Multiple entries, neatly aligned. She explained that the flagged activity had initially been routed through an operations-level access point. A subtle wave of tension passed through Emily's department. Then the officer continued, and this time the direction changed. She said the operations routing was not the origin point. It was a pass-through. A bridge. The room went very still. On the screen, a new column expanded. Upstream credentials. Executive tier. Richard's jaw flexed once, small, controlled, but unmistakable. The officer kept her voice even. She said the system logs showed the original credential initiating the access sequence belonged to an executive-level account with elevated override permissions. No one in the room was pretending not to understand anymore. Several heads slowly turned toward the stage table. Lauren's breathing had become just slightly more visible in her shoulders. Not dramatic, but no longer perfectly composed. Emily finally moved. Just one step closer to the front, still respectful, still controlled. Her voice, when she spoke, carried cleanly through the ballroom. She said she had flagged the pattern the moment she saw the override trail. She said she had submitted it through internal review 3 weeks ago. This time, the reaction was immediate. Multiple executives along the wall exchanged sharp looks. 3 weeks. That timeline mattered. Richard's eyes moved from the screen to Emily for the first time since the data appeared. The look was different now. Not dismissive, not confident. Calculating. The compliance officer lifted one hand slightly toward the display. She said the team had one final credential confirmation to present. The screen shifted again. One line zoomed forward. User identification field expanding slowly across the massive LED wall. The entire ballroom leaned into the silence. Lauren's hand slipped from the edge of the table, and Richard Hale stopped breathing for half a second as the name began to resolve. The name finished rendering. Lauren Hale. For a fraction of a second, the ballroom did not react. It was the kind of silence that happens when the brain refuses to catch up with the eyes. Then the shift hit. Sharp, unavoidable. A low wave of whispers broke loose before people forced themselves quiet again. Executives along the side wall went rigid. One senior director slowly leaned back in his chair like the air had just been knocked out of the room. On stage, Lauren did not move, but the composure she had worn all morning finally cracked. just slightly. Her shoulders stiffened, her chin lowered by a fraction. Enough. Richard Hale remained standing near the podium, but something in his posture had changed in a way no amount of executive training could fully hide. His gaze locked on the screen, then moved slowly toward his eldest daughter. Not angry, not yet, but no longer certain. The compliance officer spoke again, calm and precise. She said the credential had been verified across multiple log points. No system error, no routing anomaly, confirmed executive-level access. Each word landed like a quiet hammer. Emily stood in the aisle, still holding the black folder at her side. She did not look triumphant. She did not look relieved. She looked steady, prepared. That steadiness made several people in the room visibly uncomfortable. Lauren finally moved. Her voice, when it came, was controlled but thinner than before. She said there had to be a mistake. She said executive credentials could be mirrored, delegated, shared during high-level reviews. Professional language, carefully chosen. But the confidence behind it was slipping. The compliance officer gave a small, respectful nod. She said the team had already reviewed for credential mirroring and delegation pathways. A pause. Then she added the detail that broke the room open. No authorized delegation was on file. This time the reaction was audible. Not loud, but unmistakable. Richard's hand flattened slowly against the podium surface. The movement was subtle, but it carried weight. His eyes had not left Lauren. For the first time that morning, he looked like a father caught off balance. Lauren's breathing had become visible now, controlled, but no longer calm. Emily finally spoke again. Her voice was quiet, even. She said she had never requested the town hall spotlight. She said she had only followed the access trail where company policy required. No accusation. No gloating. Just fact. And somehow that made it worse. The compliance officer straightened slightly. She said the review would now move into formal investigative status pending executive oversight. In corporate language, it was measured. In human language, it was devastating. Across the ballroom, employees were no longer pretending to look neutral. The social gravity in the room had flipped completely. Richard Hale slowly lifted his gaze from Lauren, and for the first time that morning, he looked directly at Emily without authority behind it. No one spoke for several long seconds. The kind of silence that settles after something irreversible has already happened. Richard Hale remained near the podium, but the authority that usually filled the space around him had thinned. Not gone. Never gone completely, but weakened in a way everyone in that ballroom could feel. Across the stage table, Lauren sat very still. Too still. Her earlier composure had not shattered into drama. That was not her style. Instead, it had drained out slowly, leaving behind something tighter, more brittle. Her eyes stayed forward, but the controlled ease she carried at the start of the town hall was gone. Employees were no longer hiding their reactions. A senior manager in the second row leaned toward his colleague, whispering behind a half-raised hand. Someone near the aisle lowered their phone only after realizing they had been recording for several uninterrupted minutes. Along the side wall, two executives had subtly stepped farther apart from the stage table. Distance. Even small shifts mattered in rooms like this. Emily remained where she was in the aisle. The black folder rested calmly at her side again. She did not move toward the stage. She did not press the moment. That restraint landed harder than any speech would have. Richard finally cleared his throat. The sound was quiet but carried. When he spoke, the smooth executive cadence was still there, but it no longer filled the room the same way. He said the company would allow the compliance team to complete its formal review. Measured, careful, damage control. The compliance officer gave a small professional nod, already stepping slightly to the side as if the procedural part of the moment had concluded. But the emotional weight in the ballroom had not lifted, not even close. Lauren's hand moved slowly to the edge of the table again, but this time the gesture lacked its earlier confidence. Her fingers rested there without gripping, as if she'd not yet decided what posture to hold. Richard's gaze shifted across the room once more, not scanning now, assessing. For the first time that morning, he was reading the room instead of controlling it, and the room was no longer fully with him. Emily finally took one quiet breath. Then she spoke. Her voice remained calm, respectful, but clear enough to carry to the back wall. She said she trusted the process to move forward properly. No edge, no accusation, just quiet certainty. Several employees straightened in their seats, because that tone sounded like someone who already knew how that would end. Richard's eyes returned to her. This time, the look held something new. Not dismissal, not authority, recognition, and something dangerously close to regret. Lauren shifted in her chair. Small movement, but enough. Her shoulders had drawn inward by a fraction, the first visible sign that the pressure was no longer theoretical. She kept her chin lifted, but the stillness now looked forced rather than natural. The compliance officer quietly conferred with a member of the executive team near the stage steps. Low voices, professional posture. But the message was obvious to anyone watching closely. This was no longer a contained internal concern. It was moving upward. Formal. Documented. Unavoidable. Emily did not watch them. She was still looking at her father, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just steady. That made it worse. Richard exhaled slowly through his nose, the movement almost invisible. Then he stepped back from the podium. Not retreating, but no longer fully anchored to it either. Across the ballroom, the unspoken realization settled in. The power in the room had shifted, and everyone knew exactly when it had happened. The ballroom did not empty all at once. It unraveled. Small clusters of employees stood slowly, conversations kept low and careful. No one wanted to be the first to speak too loudly after what they had just witnessed. The LED screen had already returned to the company logo, but the damage from what it had shown still hung thick in the air. Emily stepped out into the executive hallway without rushing. Polished marble floors. Muted corporate lighting. The kind of quiet space where difficult conversations usually happened behind closed doors. She had almost reached the elevator bank when she heard his voice behind her. Low, controlled. Richard Hale. He asked her to wait. Emily stopped, not turning immediately, not tense either, just still. Footsteps approached, measured, slower than his usual stride. When she finally turned, he was standing a few feet away, hands loosely at his sides instead of folded with executive precision. That alone said more than words. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence here felt different from the ballroom. Less public, more personal. Richard studied her carefully, as if recalculating something he thought he had already solved years ago. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its stage polish. He said she should have come to him directly. Emily's expression did not harden, but it did not soften either. She said she had followed company protocol. Simple. Accurate. Hard to argue with. A faint line appeared between Richard's brows. He paced once across the narrow stretch of hallway, then stopped again, facing her more fully now. He said this situation was more complicated than she understood. Emily held his gaze. Steady. She said she understood the audit trail perfectly. That landed. Richard exhaled slowly, one hand resting briefly on his hip before dropping again. The movement carried frustration, but also something else. Unease. For the first time in years, he was not fully certain of his footing with her. His voice lowered slightly. He said the board would be watching this closely. Emily nodded once. She said she expected they would. No edge, no defiance. Just quiet acceptance of reality. That unsettled him more than anger would have. Another brief silence stretched between them. Richard's shoulders eased back a fraction. But the movement looked more tired than relaxed now. He studied her again. Longer this time. As if seeing her clearly for the first time in a while. When he spoke again, the words came slower. He said she had handled the room. Professionally. Not praise, not quite an apology either, but the closest he had come so far. Emily absorbed the words without reacting. Then she gave him the one thing he was not expecting. A boundary, calm, clean. She said this was never about the room. It was about the record being accurate. Richard went very still. Because that sentence made something painfully clear. She had not come to fight him. She had come to correct the story. And now, for the first time that morning, Richard Hale looked like a man realizing the ground under his family had shifted in a way he could not easily control. By the next morning, Hale dynamics felt different. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in the subtle ways that experienced employees always noticed first. Conversations lowered when certain names came up. Calendar invites carried more people than usual, and the executive floor, normally smooth and predictable, had developed that faint undercurrent of corporate tension that meant something serious was moving behind the scenes. Emily saw it the moment she stepped off the elevator. Two analysts near the glass corridor straightened slightly when she passed. Not awkward, not exaggerated. Just more aware than before. Respect mixed with curiosity. Word had traveled. It always did. Inside the executive wing, the board had already convened an early review session. No official announcement had gone out yet, but the signs were clear. Legal had been pulled in. Compliance had expanded the audit scope overnight. And Lauren's calendar, once packed wall to wall, now showed a clean, silent block across the next several days. Pending review. In corporate language, that phrase carried weight. Emily reached her workstation and set her bag down quietly. She did not check the hallway. She did not look toward the executive offices. She simply opened her laptop and began working. That, more than anything, caught attention. Across the open floor, one of the senior project managers watched her for a moment longer than necessary before returning to his screen. Another colleague gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod while passing by. No one said anything out loud. They did not need to. Mid-morning, an internal memo appeared. Brief, carefully worded. It stated that an executive-level access review was now in formal investigation status. It confirmed that certain responsibilities had been temporarily reassigned pending outcome. No names listed, but everyone knew. A quiet wave moved through the building. On the top floor, Richard Hale stood alone inside the executive conference room, looking out across the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling glass. His posture was still composed, still controlled. But the stillness now carried weight instead of ease. Behind him on the long conference table sat a thin stack of printed reports. Compliance summaries, access logs, timeline confirmations. The facts were no longer flexible. Richard exhaled slowly through his nose, one hand resting briefly against the back of a chair. For the first time in a long while, the problem in front of him was not operational. It was personal. Downstairs, Emily continued working through her morning cue. No victory lap, no quiet celebration, just steady, methodical focus. Around her, the office atmosphere had shifted in a way that could not easily be reversed. Conversations with her were more direct now, more measured. People who once overlooked her role were suddenly looping her into threads earlier, not dramatically, but noticeably. Late in the afternoon, another internal notice went out to senior staff. Lauren Hale had been placed on administrative leave pending completion of the formal review. Short, clinical, final in tone. Across the building, screens dimmed for a moment as employees read the update. Emily saw the notice, too. Her expression did not change. She simply closed the message window and returned to her work. Because the part that mattered most to her had never been the announcement. It had been the record. And now, the record was finally correcting itself. By the end of the week, the shift inside Hale Dynamics was no longer subtle. It had settled. Not loud, not dramatic, but permanent enough that people had begun adjusting their behavior without even realizing it. Emily noticed it in small ways first. Meeting invites started including her earlier in the chain. Project leads paused to ask for her read before finalizing decisions. Even the executive assistants, normally neutral to the point of invisibility, now looped her into threads with quiet efficiency. No one mentioned the town hall. No one needed to. The memory of that morning still lived in the walls. Emily moved through the office with the same steady pace she had always kept. Same posture, same calm focus. She did not lean into the attention. She did not pull away from it either. She simply did the work. That consistency made the shift feel earned instead of sudden. Mid-afternoon, she stepped into a strategy review meeting on the 12th floor. The room was already half full. Conversations lowered slightly when she entered, then resumed in a more structured tone. Professional, measured, respectful. One of the senior directors slid a printed packet toward her before the meeting began. He asked for her take on the risk flags in Section 3. No hesitation, no second-guessing. The kind of question that 3 weeks ago would have been routed somewhere else first. Emily flipped open the packet and reviewed the page calmly. Across the table, 2 managers watched her closely. Not suspicious, not doubtful, evaluating. Trust-building in real time. When she spoke, her voice was clear and precise. She pointed out a small inconsistency in the timeline assumptions. Suggested a cleaner verification path, nothing dramatic, just accurate. The director nodded slowly, already making a note in the margin. Decision adjusted, just like that. The meeting moved forward. Later that evening, as the office began to thin out, Emily gathered her things and stepped into the executive hallway. The same polished corridor where her father had stopped her days earlier. This time, the energy felt different. Quieter, but steadier. Richard Hale stood near the glass conference wall, reviewing something on his tablet. When he noticed her approaching, he did not look surprised. He looked thoughtful. The space between them was comfortable, but no longer casual. A recalibration had taken place. He gave a small nod as she passed. Professional, measured, but notably different from the dismissive glances of the past. Emily returned the nod. Nothing more. Nothing less. No long conversation. No forced resolution. Just two professionals acknowledging the new reality inside the same company. As she continued down the hallway toward the elevators, several employees stepped aside to give her space to pass. Not out of formality, out of awareness. Behind her, the executive floor remained quiet. But the balance of weight inside Hale Dynamics had shifted. And this time, it was not shifting back. Friday evening settled slowly over Hale Dynamics. Most of the building had already emptied. The usual weekday energy had thinned into quiet pockets of light across the open floor. Cleaning crews moved in the distance. Elevators chimed softly and then went still again. Emily remained at her desk a few minutes longer than usual, not because she had to, because the week had finally caught up with her. Her screen glowed with the last report she had reviewed that afternoon. Clean numbers. Verified timelines. No irregular flags. For the first time in weeks, everything in front of her lined up exactly the way it was supposed to. Accurate. Complete. She closed the file. The small click sounded louder in the quiet office. For a moment, she leaned back in her chair and let the silence settle. The tension from the town hall, the investigation, the long stretch of careful restraint. It had all moved fast once the truth surfaced, but the cost of it still lingered. Not regret, just wait. Across the darkening floor, a few remaining desk lamps cast soft pools of light. The company logo reflected faintly in the glass wall beyond her workstation. Emily stood and gathered her things. No rush, no victory energy, just steady movement forward. As she stepped into the executive hallway, the building felt different than it had at the start of the week. Not because anything dramatic had changed overnight, because clarity had replaced uncertainty. Halfway down the corridor, she slowed briefly near the glass overlooking the city. Evening traffic moved far below, headlights threading quietly through the streets. Behind her, measured footsteps approached. Richard Hale stopped a few feet away. Not too close, not distant either. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was no longer sharp, but it was honest. Richard's voice, when it came, was lower than it had been on the town hall stage days earlier. He said the board review would conclude early next week. Emily nodded once. She said she expected it would. Another brief silence passed between them. Richard studied her carefully, the way he had in the hallway before, but something in his expression had shifted again. Less certainty, more reflection. He said the situation had developed differently than he anticipated. Carefully chosen words, still controlled, but no longer dismissive. Emily held his gaze. Calm, clear, she said the record usually does. That landed, not as a challenge, as truth. Richard exhaled slowly, looking past her for a moment toward the dim executive floor. When his eyes returned to her, the edge that had defined him at the podium was gone. Not defeated, but changed. He gave a small nod. Professional. Respectful. Emily returned it. Then she turned toward the elevators. As the doors closed in front of her a few seconds later, the building behind her remained quiet, steady, and unmistakably different from the start of the week. Some moments explode, others simply reset the balance. This one had done both. Before the screen fades, consider this. If you were in that room, would you have spoken up when the record was wrong, or stayed silent and let the story stand? Monday morning arrived clean and quiet. Inside Hale Dynamics, the atmosphere had stabilized into something more formal. Less whispering now. Less uncertainty. The kind of corporate calm that only returns after decisions have already been made behind closed doors. At 9:12 sharp, the internal notice went out. Short, precise, final. The board had completed its review. The access irregularities had been formally attributed to unauthorized executive-level activity. Corrective actions were being implemented. Oversight protocols were being strengthened. Lauren Hale would not be returning to her previous role. No dramatic language, no public spectacle, just the clean weight of corporate consequence. Across the building, employees read the notice in silence. Screens dimmed, brows tightened. A few quiet glances passed between desks. Then work resumed, because that is what companies do. Emily saw the notice at the same time as everyone else. She read it once, closed the window, and moved on to her morning cue. No visible reaction. No pause long enough to draw attention. But something inside her finally settled into place. Not satisfaction, not relief, closure. Late morning, she was called into a smaller strategy session on the executive floor. This time, the invitation came directly from the Risk Oversight Group. That alone said enough. Inside the glass-walled room, 3 senior leaders were already seated. When Emily entered, the tone was professional but noticeably different from weeks earlier. More direct, more respectful. They wanted her assessment on strengthening the internal audit triggers, not as a courtesy, as input. Emily took her seat and reviewed the material calmly. She pointed out where the escalation thresholds had failed, suggested tighter cross-checks between credential tiers, flagged one quiet vulnerability in the after-hours monitoring window. The room listened, carefully. Adjustments were made in real time. By the time the meeting ended, the updated protocol framework had her notes embedded across multiple sections. Earned authority, not assigned. As she stepped back into the executive hallway, Richard Hale stood near the far window, tablet in hand. He looked up as she approached. There was no tension left in the space between them now. Only awareness. He gave a small nod. She returned it. Nothing more needed. Because the story had already corrected itself. That afternoon, Hale Dynamics moved forward. Steadier, cleaner, wiser than it had been the week before. And Emily walked back to her desk without looking over her shoulder. Not because the past week had been easy, because she no longer needed to. Before you go, one question. If someone publicly underestimated you, would you stay quiet, or would you bring the receipts when it mattered most? If this story kept you watching, subscribe to Final Text for more real-world drama that hits harder than fiction. And tell us in the comments, did Richard truly learn his lesson? Or did he only adjust because he was finally forced to see the truth?